Hello and welcome back. This is our second installment of our character deep dive of Ilya Rozanov. I'm going to be going scene by scene chronologically through the show and examining the subtextual storytelling. Subtext being the hidden or underlying meaning of a scene that isn't explicitly communicated through dialogue or exposition. And we can eke out this subtext by examining things like visual storytelling through lighting, camera work, actor performance, body language, tone, as well as what we can glean through character study. If you are new here, my name is Nina. I am getting my PhD in creative writing. I study narrative craft. And as a fiction writer, I feel it really beneficial to my own craft to do these kind of character deep dives. When you can study and tease out and examine the inner workings of character, that number one is a really good learning experience, but I also think it's a huge source of creative inspiration. So we are going to be talking about three things in our video today. Number one, we're going to be talking about what we know about Ilya's life, character development, backstory prior to the chronological events of this story. I went over this in the initial video that I did of this series, which was on TikTok, but in an effort to consolidate everything onto one platform, I'm going to be going back and summarizing the major points of that video as well as adding some new ones. I went back and did some more research on the socio-cultural state of Russia in 1991 when Ilya was born, because I think that that aspect of the setting is completely unstated in the show, and yet these are the sort of character influences that make themselves known in subtle ways, which allows us to get a much deeper overall understanding of a character. Two, we're going to be doing an in-depth look at this sort of expository scene in which we are introduced to Shane and Ilya as hockey players through the sports announcer. And then three, we're going to look very closely at a scene which breaks my fucking heart that happens between Ilya, his father, and his coach on the night of the draft. So I think that this video is going to be a much longer one than the last one, so let's get into it. Okay. Backstory. Ilya was born in Russia in June of 1991, which was about 6 months prior to the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. When we think about setting as a craft element, it's usually defined as the where and when of the events of the story. And so in particular, this when of Ilya's childhood taking place at this time of great economic, social, and cultural upheaval in Russia is going to be really important for our understanding of who he develops into as a character. If you are a creative writer and you want to know your characters really intimately, you have to think about how they were raised, because all of those influences of their childhood are going to make themselves known in their adult form. So for instance, post this 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was serious economic decline in post-Soviet nations. Between 1990 and 2000, the Russian GDP dropped 40%. Inflation was running rampant. The price of consumer goods went up 300 to 400%. There were waves of hunger and excess mortality. And so this is important when we think about how economic hardship makes itself known in sociocultural ways. And I want to preface this by saying I am by no means an expert in Russian culture. I can only attest to what I have read over the course of an afternoon, which is obviously not going to enable me to get any sort of full picture. But if there are any members of this audience who are from Russia or who have family from Russia, I would be really interested in hearing from you in the comments if you are willing to share some of your thoughts on sort of cultural expectations surrounding gender norms at that time, because I do really want this analysis that I'm doing to be in conversation. I'm always going to read all the comments, and I appreciate all the different perspectives that I'm able to see through them. And also my understanding of analysis in general is that I'm coming to this piece of art through the lens of my own subjectivities. If we subscribe to the Roland Barthes death of the author theory, we understand that art is not solely owned and defined by the people who created it, but instead meaning is made in the relationship that a audience member has with the art itself. So let's return to talking about Russia in the 1990s. When I was reading about cultural gender roles in Russia in the 90s and 2000s when this story took place, these gender roles were known to be deeply patriarchal, conservative, traditional. And the sort of economic upheaval that happened post-dissolution of the Soviet Union had massive influences in the social cultural state of Russia. And I want to give a content warning for discussions of domestic violence. To skip past this part, please hit this timestamp. From my understanding, these gender roles looked like in the dominant culture, women were responsible for sort of domestic work, cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children. But during this time of economic upheaval, a lot of women also went and got jobs outside of the home. And from what we can understand about patriarchal systems, which it's important to talk about the role of the patriarch in this sense, the patriarch being the male father, head of the family, during this time when women's roles were changing within the family structure, along with the economic upheaval, the really increased premature mortality. Russian women in the workforce faced really extreme rates of workplace harassment, workplace violence. Rates of domestic violence against women also soared. In 1993, an estimated 14,000 women were murdered by their husbands or lovers. This was about 20 times the figure in the United States and several times the figure in Russia only 5 years earlier. So returning back to the story world of Heated Rivalry, the childhood of Ilya Rozanov, we understood that his father was a lot older than his mother. We will, of course, be looking at this scene more in depth later in this series, but in the scene in the cottage when Ilya is discussing his mother with Shane, this is the most we ever hear him talk about his mother, and this is where we can kind of like glean our knowledge about their relationship. So we know from the course of the show that Ilya has a very bad relationship with both his father and his brother. Both of them are emotionally abusive, but in the very sweet and fond way that he talks about his mother to Shane, we can assume that Ilya had a close and loving relationship with his mother. And that would mean that his mother was the only person in the family with whom he had a close relationship. Later in the season, he said that his brother had always hated him. When Ilya is discussing his mother's depression, he says, "She was so sad and my dad was so hard on her." And so this line of dialogue could be signaling that their relationship, that of Ilya's parents, was a abusive one, either physically or emotionally. And also from the phrasing, it seems as though Ilya's dad was particularly hard on his mother because she had depression. Ilya says to Shane after he talks about his mother's suicide, like, "I don't want you to think she was weak." And so evidently this idea for him that like sadness and depression is correlated with weakness had to come from somewhere, and we can imagine that this was influenced by his father. And this sort of core idea of sadness, vulnerability, emotionality equaling weakness, this sort of thing being introduced and reinforced in childhood is going to have massive implications on a person's emotional development. And so we're going to see time and again throughout the series Ilya's fear of being vulnerable, of being emotional. In episode 6 of The Cottage, Ilya also reveals that his mother took her own life when he was 12 years old and he was the one to find her body. I don't think that we can overstate the kind of trauma that that experience would have on a child, and so we'll leave that there for now. But going back to this idea of Ilya growing up in a society with rigidly enforced patriarchal gender roles, we can learn a lot about Ilya's relationship with his patriarch, his father. In Ilya's scenes with his father, we see him being uniformly obedient and submissive. His father is consistently unfair and cruel, and yet Ilya, who we know in other contexts as being very confident, very combative, makes himself very small in context with his father, and even in a sense in context with his brother, who Ilya still in a sense obeys but does so with a lot more pushback. His brother having like a higher position in this patriarchal power structure, being the elder brother. In the scene that I'm going to be talking about later where Ilya interacts with his coach and his father, we can track how Ilya around his father is tense, rigid, and hypervigilant. His anxiety is apparent in how he acts. Lastly, for Ilya's character backstory, he realized that he was queer ostensibly as a teenager in a country where being outed as queer could be dangerous both to him personally and definitely professionally in terms of his career. And even so, his first queer experience was with his coach's son in Russia. And this person being Ilya's first queer sexual entanglement is important because by sneaking around under the nose of his coach, who is the person who is like responsible for his career, it's risky, it's a little reckless, which we've talked about in context with Ilya's character before. And again, he expresses later that he likes danger and trouble. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of his character is tracking these like opposing forces within his life. In terms of his relationship with his father, Ilya is made to be very buttoned up, hypervigilant, anxious, suppressed, probably feeling a sense of powerlessness. And then on the other side, this version of Ilya that is reckless, enjoys taking risks, enjoys danger, truly enjoys rule breaking. And we, in doing this character study, can see this one side of him being in response to the other. This sort of heady recklessness as a response to a feeling of suppression and lack of agency. So before we move on to the sports announcer thing, I also wanted to express two things that I said in the TikTok, but I think are important to like couch this conversation. Number one is that I am not going to be using the books as a definitive canon for this analysis. I have read the books. I think that they are totally fine and enjoyable and very conventional genre fiction, but not dazzling. And I'm glad that they exist and that they inspired the show. But what the producers and directors and performers and cinematographers have done with the source material in the medium of the show have turned it into something that is so much bigger and grander and completely its own. And also due to the medium of film, the fact that we don't get characters' internal monologues, their interiority, this on a craft level like fundamentally changes how the storytelling can even be done. And if there is interest from y'all, I can definitely talk more about that later. But this is all to say that I am much more interested in viewing this show as a piece of freestanding art rather than something that is beholden to the original text. And secondly, this topic came up in the original video when I was talking about their initial meeting scene, and there is a moment where he is struggling to work his lighter. Shane comes from around the corner, and then Ilya's lighter works. I think that much has been made of this moment on the online discourse about this show, which I think is cool and fine, and I respect all interpretations. But I do think that the way we talk about these things is important in kind of our understanding of how we're interpreting this as a piece of art. So what I've been seeing people say is the lighter represents this spark, or that Shane coming into the picture at this particular moment represents that he is Ilya's flame or his light. And while I think that this is an interesting observation, I do think it can be detrimental to the understanding of complex storytelling when we start to look at this show through the lens of these old familiar tropes of love at first sight. The idea it was always you from the first moment I saw you. It's this fantasy of certainty. And what I think is exactly what makes this show so good is that it subverts a lot of these tropes. The characters are not in love from the beginning, and that, again, doesn't make it a worse love story. I think that Ilya is an incredibly complex character that represents complex post-traumatic stress disorder, disorganized attachment, someone who has experienced abuse and trauma, figuring out how to open himself up to love. That, for me, is the core of this story's interest, right? And I think on a storytelling level, having the connection between these two characters be immediate love at first sight is so much more conventional and less deep than what I think the show can do, which is really intricate portrayals of complicated characters. What makes the story feel so satisfying is the arc, right? And in order to have a big, satisfying arc, characters have to start from somewhere. From my reading, I think that at the beginning, Ilya is incredibly emotionally closed off, not receptive, I don't even think it enters into his worldview that he could have an emotional attachment to this person. But that means that the fact that he inevitably does makes it so much more satisfying. Okay, so now we are almost at the point where we're going to start talking about this introductory, expository hockey scene. But once more, I want to preface and I want to couch by talking about how important introductory scenes are. I am so anti it's not that deep, it's always that deep. At the point where the scene starts, we are a little over 3 minutes into a 50-minute episode, an episode which is one of 6. The first minutes of the show, the first pages of a book, are of the utmost importance, because this is what your potential audience is going to be checking out when they are deciding whether or not to dive into the story. And so the task that these few minutes are responsible for is huge. It needs to both grab attention, create interest, create stakes, but while on one hand functioning as a hook, it also has to lay a strong enough foundation in terms of plot, character, and theme that the remainder of the show can rest on. So when I teach creative writing and I emphasize concision, which is using as few words as possible to express what you're trying to express, I talk about it in terms of page real estate. The closer you are to the beginning of a piece, the more expensive each paragraph's worth of page real estate is. And so the text that you have better earn its place. And so the job of the scene that we're about to talk about, which is introducing our characters, it is going to be responsible for communicating these aspects of their characters that are most important for us to know at the outset. So in this scene, on the surface, we're getting this little exposition from the sports announcer, but we're also getting this little subplot where Shane and Ilya watch each other practice. And so again, this is my Ilya character deep dive. I'm going to save Shane's character deep dive for another time, but the show is doing a lot of work to put them in contrast with each other. And so talking about how Shane contrasts Ilya in his portrayal here is going to help us understand what parts of Ilya we're supposed to be clocking. So Shane is discussed first. He's portrayed by the sports announcer as being one who plays smarter, not harder. They talk about his hockey IQ. They make a point of showing his precision, and if we remember later in the show, he beats Ilya at the shot accuracy competition. So Shane is smart, precise, and very fast, and also not sociable. And they also make a point of saying that Shane is incredibly dedicated to the game, and they don't for Ilya. And this is going to be something we talk about later, is what is Ilya's relationship to hockey, and is it love? Then when Ilya is introduced, said strong on the puck, strong skater. When they're using this language of strength, they show a shot of him slamming one of his teammates into the boards. The boards? I don't know. Into the the wall. And then they say, from everything that we've heard, he really gets under other players' skins. Again, we covered this in the last episode. He plays hockey as a physical game, but also as a mind game. The language that we're given about him is about strength and aggression. Good in his own room, not exactly liked in his opponent's room. I really love this shot where he's fighting with his teammate with just this look of glee on his face. And then at the very end of this kind of sequence on Ilya, first we see him looking at Shane, and then we see him get reprimanded by his coach. And so again, the fact that this little interaction with his coach is placed in this super important sequence of like character setup and exposition means that it is important, right? We're learning something about how the Russian hockey team operates. Ilya, although he has just been characterized as being like aggressive and combative, responds to his coach reprimanding him by just like a little meek nod of his head. In the sphere of like Russian men that Ilya interacts with in positions of power over him, his father, his brother, his coach, he is much more submissive, much more obedient. And again, this relates to the Russian cultural expectations that we were talking about earlier. So now let's look at this little subplot in which Shane and Ilya watch each other practice. When Shane sees Ilya watching him, Ilya is manspreading and chewing on his hoodie string. We kind of saw him doing this earlier where he was like chewing on his cigarette. We see the characters a lot over the course of the show, like always kind of putting things in their mouths. And I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say that this like oral fixation has like a sexual tone to it. So we see first Ilya observing Shane. Next, we see Shane observing Ilya. Now, again, on first watch through, all that this little subplot might communicate is that they're like intrigued by each other, that there's a sort of interest that they're watching each other. And it also like because this show is marketed as like a gay romance, it's like kind of a spoiler in that viewers are going to be expecting these two to get together eventually. So it's like ramping up this tension. But the other thing that this little sequence of shots communicate is that Ilya watching Shane, that shot alone doesn't tell us much, but when it is mirrored by this shot of Shane, who is accompanied by his mother, that highlights how Ilya is alone. Later in the show, we learn that Ilya's family can't even really be bothered to show up to see Ilya play in the Olympics when they're in Russia. But here, Ilya is understanding Shane as someone who is loved and accepted by his family. And also, in this scene, Ilya is supposed to be 17. It has only been 5 years since his mother died, and I can't imagine that that's not on his mind. I also just want to shout out the color grading on this sequence. The like super blue shadow undertones with the pops of red. It's like gorgeous. Then it cuts 1 week later. It is the end of the game that Shane and Ilya have played against each other. The Russian team won. I really like this detail that they're like really sweaty. It's like, right, it's little details like this which make something feel more realistic. But while they're going along the lines and shaking hands and say good game, Ilya kind of pulls close to Shane and says, see you at the draft. Now, okay, we've been talking a lot about how subtext shows up in like narrative storytelling, but here is an example of how subtext shows up in dialogue, in character interactions. So remember when I talked last time about how when a person is queer coming from a place in which queerness is not accepted, or how being outed could be possibly dangerous. And even though the scene is not taking place in Russia, throughout the entirety of Ilya and Shane's relationship, there's always the threat of like, if Ilya were to be outed as queer, like what possible ramifications that might have for like his visa. So again, any moves that he's making towards Shane have to be careful. And this little line between him just saying, see you at the draft, like pulling him close, looking in his eyes, is an instance of this sort of like coded language. Remember, the last time they interacted before this scene was the show's first one right outside the hockey rink, and we came to understand through analyzing that scene that at the conclusion of the scene, Ilya is aware that Shane has some sort of attraction to him. Ilya is excited at this sort of like power that this gives him. He's coming from this place of being very repressed, not being able to act agentially. He loves the thought of like danger and risk. And again, that is what Shane is representing to him right now. So him singling Shane out and saying, I'll see you later, that again, it's coded language. There is plausible deniability. There is nothing inherently flirtatious or forward. If Shane were to like tell somebody else that Ilya said, see you at the draft, it would mean nothing, right? But within the context of their interactions, it is flirting, but it's subtextually. To anyone who is maybe witnessing this interaction, it would look like nothing. Maybe it would just look like shit talking. But to Ilya, he's referencing this very loaded interaction that him and Shane had. Like, do you remember the way that Ilya was looking at him before? And Shane's reaction, I argue, signals that he's thinking of the same thing. He looks nervous. 6 months passes, and now we're at the draft in Los Angeles. Ilya has gotten the number 1 pick in the draft. Ilya has this huge smile on his face, and it's not just that he's smiling, but he's like regularly looking over to Shane, who is very obviously upset. You know, he's gloating. And then we follow it up with this like event that's happening where the coaches of the teams that drafted the players are interacting with the players and their families. We get Shane's interaction with his parents and the coach first. Again, we're not going to get deep into him, but I do want to point out the things that are going to become important in how they are contrasting Ilya's similar interaction with his coach and his dad. So we open on Shane dissociating. It has been established very openly by the author of the book and also the showrunners that Shane is on the spectrum. We'll get back to Shane in a moment, but let's skip to the end of this interaction. Shane looks up at Ilya to see that Ilya is looking down at him. This is a very different glance at Shane than the one that we've seen Ilya do before. He's not trying to look seductive. He just kind of looks sad, and we'll talk about why. This scene makes me so sad. And it becomes important throughout the course of the scene that Ilya is turning away and looking at Shane is much less about him looking towards Shane and much more about what he's turning away from. So again, the context for the scene, Ilya just had the number 1 draft pick for the NHL. This is a huge day for him. He literally could not have done better. And yet he doesn't look happy. The first line that we hear is the coach complimenting him. We're not passing on a kid this strong with these hands, right? Again, emphasizing like the strength with which he plays. We've seen the way that Ilya smiles before. When he smiles at Shane, the kind of like cocky one he had on the ice when he was fucking with his teammate. And again, like all the props to Connor Story's performance here. The smile that he's giving is so like palpably uncomfortable. And so when the coach is talking, we never actually see the coach. We just kind of see the back of his head. At the end of this line of dialogue, he says, Mr. Rozanoff. It becomes clear that he's talking to Ilya's father, that the coach is complimenting Ilya to his father, which ostensibly the coach would think that Ilya's father would be happy about, right? And yet Ilya looks uncomfortable because he knows his father. Then the coach, he's a very natural number 1 pick. He says that to Ilya's father, right? And then he turns his attention to Ilya and he says, congratulations again, Ilya. Oh, it kills me. As soon as he says congratulations, Ilya's eyes dart to the side, right? He cannot make eye contact. He covers his expression by taking a sip of water. It could not be more obvious that he is feeling incredibly anxious at being complimented in front of his father. He feels afraid of even openly accepting this compliment, even by making eye contact. And in response, he doesn't say anything, just gives a little nod. And then we hear from Ilya's fucking father. He said he is strong, but he needs discipline. He can be lazy. And it makes me want to cry. Like, in response to this, Ilya doesn't look angry. He doesn't look combative. His face just falls into this like utter sadness. And you can see the like shifting micro expressions. Again, amazing performance. This is a humiliation ritual. He just got the number 1 draft pick for the NHL. This is his day. And yet we could tell from the very beginning of this scene that he knew he was never going to be allowed to enjoy this. When Ilya's coach then contradicts Ilya's father by saying, I find that hard to believe, Ilya doesn't smile. He doesn't accept the compliment, again, because he knows that that would anger his father. He just said, I promise to work very hard for you. He doesn't reference his obvious talent. He just talks about what he can give, what he can provide for this coach. A recurring theme in Ilya's character arc is that he has consistently been given this impression that his worth comes from what he can give other people. And so again, Ilya has such control over his expressions, over his language. You can tell that this is the manifestation of hypervigilance, of putting forth all his effort in trying to do things that will avoid angering his father. And yet his father is not fair, nor is he rational with the kind of criticism that he gives. Ilya is walking through an unmarked minefield. This is a point at which I will reference the book. There's a scene later in the book in which Ilya is meeting up with his father. He's going to a fancy event. He's impeccably dressed in a suit. And as he's walking to meet his father, he's trying to imagine what it is about his appearance that his father is going to find to criticize. Because the truth of it is that no matter how vigilant Ilya is, how hard he tries, how anxious he is to avoid displeasing his father is going to be displeased as a rule. And this like threat of criticism is what keeps Ilya in this sort of like anxious, controlled, repressed state. And so Ilya has, in this scene, which again I'm referencing from the book because I think it gives kind of like a textual example of this thing that we're seeing in the show. Ilya has tried to like perfect his appearance in order to give his father nothing to critique. And yet when he shows up, his father like looks him over trying to find something and eventually, tells him that his hair is too long. So Ilya has become inured to this idea that his father is going to criticize him, and yet he still tries to be perfect. When his father says, you listen, you don't speak, you understand, which in the context of this conversation is positioning Ilya's father as this like proprietary figure over Ilya. Ilya's father is saying, I speak to the coach. I speak for you. You do not speak for yourself, right? Ilya is being made to be submissive, obedient, small, repressed. After his father says, don't speak, he just says, yes, and continues looking forward. And so at the outset of this scene, when Ilya is looking over this balcony and looking at Shane, this is like a metaphorical gaze, right? He's turning away from this conversation in which he's being made to feel small and devalued and anxious and like he can do nothing right, and looking over at Shane, who represents the kind of excitement, risk, and power that he craves to get out of this feeling of smallness and numbness that his father makes him feel. And so I want to use this moment to talk about Ilya as a representation of someone with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder differs from just PTSD in that the complex denotes prolonged, repeated trauma, whereas one can develop PTSD from a single traumatic event. CPTSD comes from prolonged, repeated trauma. It is not uncommon in children of abuse. Common causes are long-term abuse, neglect, and domestic violence, particularly during childhood. One of the core symptoms of CPTSD is this sense of hypervigilance that we just saw Ilya exhibiting in this conversation with his father and his coach. Other symptoms are emotional dysregulation, negative self-perception, difficulties in developing and maintaining trust and relationships, substance abuse, self-harm, and dissociation. I also want to be clear that I'm not making an effort to diagnose this person who is fictional, but from a character design perspective, it is imperative that if you're designing a character who had a traumatic childhood, it is very useful to look at conditions like CPTSD. We want to depict realism, right? As I said in the last video, creative writing characters, we seek to represent complex humanity. And there is a link between certain forms of childhood trauma and the ways in which that trauma exhibits itself in adulthood. And we'll be returning to this conversation throughout the course of the series. What I want to bring up in context with this is that remember how throughout these last couple minutes of television, we keep seeing Shane and Ilya mirrored with each other. They're being compared and contrasted by us seeing them having scenes in similar circumstances, but with very dissimilar outputs. So when we look at Shane at the beginning of this post-draft celebration, Shane is openly dissociating. What we can imagine is that he's reacting to getting the number 2 draft pick. We know that Shane is very driven. He has big dreams. He has lofty goals for himself. And when he doesn't meet those goals, it negatively affects him. Now, the thing of note here is that autism and CPTSD, the ways in which they manifest, have a lot of overlapping symptoms. They're quite similar, at least according to my therapist and my psychiatrist and my other therapist. We have just witnessed Ilya in a state in which he is actively dissociating because of the anxiety and discomfort that he's experiencing in this humiliation ritual with his father. When Shane at the outset of the scene is dissociating, he is between both of his parents, and Shane's mother notices that he is dissociating because she knows her son, and she very gently puts a hand on his shoulder and brings him back into the conversation. And Shane immediately responds to this touch, looks up, becomes alert, starts talking. Each of these characters, both Shane and Ilya as characters, have dissociative tendencies. The ways in which their parents respond couldn't be more different. It is again showing that Shane is loved and supported, where Ilya is actively undergoing emotional abuse. I think I'm going to call it there. Next time, we're going to be looking at the gym scene. I've got a lot of thoughts about the way that beauty is represented in this show and how the gym scene shows that. If you have any thoughts and interpretations of the gym scene, please comment them down below. Again, this conversation is made stronger and deeper by y'all's engagement. I was not expecting anyone to watch that first video, and the fact that people did is kind of crazy. But I really appreciate it, and I have a lot of fun doing this. So if you have made it this far in the video, thank you. Please consider subscribing to follow along with the rest of this series, and I'll see you next time.